All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping into some huge theological questions. I mean, the big ones. How does salvation actually work? What's the deal with the final judgment? And probably the toughest one, what happens to someone who lives and dies without ever hearing the Christian gospel? Let's get into it.
And that really gets to the core of what we're talking about today, doesn't it? It's a question people have been wrestling with for centuries. I mean, how can one God, a just God, judge the entire world by the same standard? You've got people who lived thousands of years ago, people in totally different cultures. How does that work? How can that possibly be fair?
So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the basic problem of justice. Then, we'll check out the solution offered through Christ. After that, we'll tackle faith before the cross. And the big one, the destiny of the unevangelized. And we'll wrap it all up with the final judgment.
All right, Section 1, a problem of justice. To really get what salvation is, you first have to ask, what are we being saved from? That's the foundational problem we need to unpack.
You know, a really helpful way to think about this is like a courtroom drama. Picture it. All of humanity is on trial. God is the judge, and he's perfectly just. The crime? Sin. And the sentence for that crime is, well, it's the death penalty. And we're not just talking about physical death, but something deeper, eternal separation from God.
And this idea is laid out pretty clearly right here in Romans. It says, the wages of sin is death. A wage is something you earn, right? So the consequence of sin is this spiritual death. But then it offers this incredible contrast. But the gift of God is eternal life. A gift isn't earned, it's freely given. This sets up the central problem that needs a solution.
So, if the penalty is that severe, how can anyone escape it? Well, that brings us to the next part, the proposed divine solution. At the heart of it all is this big theological term, substitutionary atonement. But the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's the belief that Jesus didn't just die. He died as a substitute. He stepped into that divine courtroom we talked about and took the punishment that humanity deserved, in their place.
And this verse from 2 Corinthians really unpacks that idea. It's often called the Great Exchange. Think about it. Jesus, who is without sin, took our sin upon himself. And in exchange, believers are offered his righteousness. It's this incredible trade that, according to the theology, satisfies the demands of justice.
What's really fascinating is that this isn't just a New Testament concept. You can go way back to the Old Testament, to prophecies like this one in Isaiah. It's interpreted as a description of the coming Messiah, suffering, not for his own sins, but for the transgressions and iniquities, basically the wrongdoings, of others. It's a foreshadowing of that same substitution idea.
Okay, so this is where a huge question pops up, right? If salvation is all about the cross, an event from 2,000 years ago, what about all the people who lived and died before Jesus?
So, how were they saved? Was there a totally different system? Well, according to Christian theology, the answer is no. The basis for salvation has actually always been the same, even if what people knew and understood about it was different. The key, then and now, has always been faith. The idea is that people were saved by trusting in God and in his promise that one day he would provide the ultimate solution for sin. It's a concept called progressive revelation, kind of like God was slowly revealing more and more of his plan as history unfolded.
And you can actually see this playing out across the Old Testament. You have Adam, who believed a promise about a future conqueror of evil. You have Abraham, who put his faith in God's promises to him. You have David, who wrote about taking refuge in God's mercy. The thinking is that they were all exercising faith, looking forward to a promise that would one day be fulfilled by the Messiah.
Abraham is really the classic example here. Look at this verse from Genesis. Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. It wasn't about all the things he did, it was about his faith, his trust. This verse gets quoted again and again in the New Testament to make the point that faith has always been the way.
Okay, now we're getting into what might be the trickiest, most debated part of this whole discussion. What about the people who never had a chance to hear this message? I mean, someone born in a remote village centuries ago. What's their fate?
This whole thing is often called the fate of the unlearned, or the destiny of the unevangelized. And it's a huge issue because it gets right back to that question of justice. How can a fair God judge someone based on information they literally never had access to?
Well, the Apostle Paul actually tackles this head-on in the book of Romans.
He says that even people who don't have the written law, like the Ten Commandments, still have a kind of moral law written in their hearts. He says their conscience guides them, telling them right from wrong. This suggests that everyone is accountable to some standard of divine truth based on what's been revealed to them.
And you know, it's really interesting to see how different Christian denominations handle this. There's no single, universally agreed upon answer. For example, Roman Catholics and Methodists often teach that salvation could be possible for those who genuinely seek God and follow the truth they know. Other groups, like the LDS Church or Jehovah's Witnesses, have teachings about an opportunity to hear the gospel and make a choice even after death. So a whole spectrum of views here.
So we've talked about sin, salvation, faith throughout history, and all these threads are said to lead to one single massive event, the final judgment.
The book of Revelation gives us this really intense picture of what that day looks like. It talks about a great white throne with Jesus as the judge, and then the books were opened. These are understood to be a record of everything everyone has ever done. The judgment is described as totally impartial, based on what's in those books, and it all leads to a final, irreversible verdict.
Jesus himself talks about this moment using a powerful parable, the sheep and the goats. It's pretty straightforward. He separates everyone into two groups. The sheep, the righteous, are invited into the kingdom, but the goats face a very different fate, described as eternal punishment. So two very distinct final outcomes.
But, and this is a really important but, even with all this talk of judgment, the Bible constantly comes back to God's character. Look at this verse from 2 Peter. It says, God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. So despite the reality of judgment, the overriding desire is for salvation, not condemnation.
So what are we left with? It's this incredible tension, isn't it? A God of perfect justice, but also a God of incredible mercy. A reality of judgment, but also an offer of salvation. And that brings us to the final takeaway question. It's not about what happens way out in the future, but about what happens right now. If both of those things are true, mercy and justice, what does that mean for how we choose to live our lives today? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.